colleague, Russell Haidt. Russell, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Russell is a UX designer, and he's going to share his UX expertise with us today. Just a reminder before we get started, we've left some time after the presentation portion to answer your questions. So feel free to post any questions on the webinar tool, and we'll take care of those at the end. Also, just to note, this webinar is being recorded, so if you missed anything, you'll be able to review the recording. We'll also share a link to a PDF, which has some more detailed info, so we'll get those to you after the event. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about UX and awareness and process. So we're going to cover UX and how it impacts various industries, clarifying the language. So you probably have experienced all these companies at some point, whether it be hopping a ride in Uber or listening to Spotify, and we also know them. But another thing that all these companies have in common is that they're great use of design and UX. We associate how we feel about these different companies based on what our experience has been, maybe booking a room on Airbnb and how easy it is to throw your files up on Dropbox. That feeling is a direct correlation to UX. But you might be asking yourself, how is this relevant to me if I'm developing applications that are for internal use only? The bottom line is that every application, for the most part, and we, as I just mentioned, we all have used those applications, Netflix, so we expect a certain level of understanding and ease of use. The other thing, too, is that UX can impact and increase your ROI. So let me go through a couple examples of what I mean by that. The software and use, if it's maybe like customer facing, less people are going to turn away. It's easy to use. But also on the development side, UX can help the planning process, which I'll get into later, and dramatically decrease the amount of functionality you need to deploy your application. It also reduces the amount of frustration you might feel, because UX is not only just making, if you do hit an error, it clearly explains why you have the error and what you need to do to continue. So next up, I'm going to go through the lingo and terminology of UX. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of things: UI, UX, user interface, usability, all these terms that one and ships to each other. First off, a lot of times people, when I tell them that I'm a UX designer, they immediately assume, so you change the colors of things. And that is true. I often do make things pretty, but it's really just the very first step of the whole UX umbrella. So styling is actually the process we use through a language called CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's change the color. So if I want to make a button blue, I will change the color in CSS to be blue. Next we have theming. Theming is the process of taking a company's visual identity, so that's, you know, your logo, your color, you have patterns, you have print All of that is analyzed, kind of compiled to fit into your application so that it still feels like an app that fits with your brand. So theming is taking that and translating that so that you can then style it. And this styling, theming, and UI design all relate to what we see. And this is like, as you can see, it's only perhaps halfway there. And UI design is specifically where we place different objects on the page to know, to kind of orientate you. So you're like, well, clearly by this navigation along the top, I'm on this page, and I'd like to go to this page. So that placement of those objects is UI design. Next, we start to get into more of UX design with usability design. This has to do with maybe making an app more accessible to the people using it. So if an application is built for the elderly, that's going to look very different and feel very different for someone that is like a 4-year-old. So our requirements are different based on the different user groups, and that's design. Next, we have interaction design. Usability design, I kind of think of it as the human side of things. Interaction design is more of how a specific object works. So for example, something we've all experienced, a button on a website. If you hover over that button, maybe it changes color, maybe it moves a little bit. That's to let you know that that's a button and that's something to click and kind of understand that it's going to take you somewhere. And that's interaction design. And so any functionality that you want to give some subtle clues, we use interaction design to achieve that. And lastly, we have UX design. UX design can be said is all the things I've listed prior, but it also has to do with the experience and the emotional tie to how we feel about something. So we've all, booked a flight at one point or another in our lives, and if you're going through the process of booking that flight and everything's up front, or you click a flight that's $600 and then you go to the checkout and now it's $700, you're going to be upset. You're like, why does this cost this much? I thought it was this much. That's an example of very poor UX design, because they're not telling you everything you need to know so that you feel happy about their brand or about the process in general. So that in a nutshell is all the different layers of UX and UI design and how they all work together. So next, I'm going to walk through the different steps of implementing those terms that I just mentioned and at what stages of the process they come into play. So here's a loop, process. These aren't, I kind of grouped them, each of the black phrases are different slides. I just wanted to kind of give an outline as to what's going to come after what. And it's definitely not set in stone. Like, you could easily have lo-fi or medium fidelity wireframes in your project preparation, or vice versa, or you could do usability testing after each sprint. This is just more of an outline to kind of get you prepared what's coming next. So the first step in a process is before you started your project, and maybe if you're the product owner, or maybe it's during the project kickoff, you need to define several things. First off are the user groups. User groups are who will be using this application. In Mendix, we kind of already have something along these lines, and that's the user roles, and that kind of dictates what are the different security levels and who can see what. User groups touches on that, but it also kind of extends outward to who the end user is. So back to the grandparents versus kids, they really define, what they need to see. Maybe someone older needs something bigger buttons, so it's easier to use. Make sure the text is large enough, whereas someone, younger can read much smaller text and would like to see like flying animations and things like that. So those are two very different applications based on who the users are. And if you're familiar with more UX processes and stuff like that outside of this, you would know that user groups in a way are similar to personas, which are like fake descriptions of like bios of people that you use to better understand and relate back to your user flows. Next, you have, after you've defined the user groups, you need to define what those users need to do. And those are come in the form of user objectives. And that's pretty much it. You have to map what users do what things. So if you have 3 different user groups, you might have some crossover. Maybe the customer and the manager need to see the same screen and do the same objective, but the admin only needs to see maybe just the statistics of what everybody's doing, but they don't need to see those steps. So it's a matter of, for each user group, you need to define each of their objectives, what their goals in the application are. You also want to define user friction. I think user friction is generally assumed in digital applications as no friction, easy as possible. But I think with all things design, design's about considering what you're doing, thinking about considering every option, and friction is one of those. So, for example, this image, I'm sure we've all been to IKEA. They make us walk like a mile or so before we can purchase anything, and it's a very successful business model. And it kind of gives us a sense, hey, maybe I need that or this, and so it's a very flies in the face of what most people think. You should just present someone exactly what they need. So it's just something to consider along the way. So after you've defined your user groups, your objectives, and how much friction, how easy it is to accomplish a task, you want to plot out those big pieces of functionality, those objectives, through user flows. And so first you want to match each user objective to a business goal, so then you can see what the value of this application is and kind of helps quantify that. And then the user flow process is one where you can draw it out, or in the case of the image on the right side of my slide, you can do it with like Google Drawing or something where you can iterate upon it. It doesn't require to have any expertise in anything. You can just learn to do something. There's plenty of web applications out there that can help you with this sort of thing. But you basically map out step by step what you need to do in order to get to the objective point. So with this one is shopping cart. So for each step has a different box that's like a object, and then you have a diamond, which is, for those of you that are Mendix developers, can kind of be familiar as kind of a question. So do yes or no, and then if yes, this is what you do. If no, here's what you do. And it's just kind of an exercise so you understand the scope of your functionality and kind of starts to lay the groundwork of the roadmap for your application. And one other thing, user flows is really like the first iteration on defining these things. And you can iterate within the user flow until you get to a point where you're pretty comfortable with it. And once you're comfortable with that, you would progress to creating a sitemap and epics for those of you using Agile. So the sitemap is basically taking all those user flows and seeing what pages they have in common. So instead of defining a sitemap beforehand, when you think you need this and you think you need this, you really know, okay, these different layers of functionality. I need a home page, I need a dashboard, I need a checkout, and the sitemap can show you how those different pages are connected. And then as far as epics go, you can, from those user flows, you can kind of get some large epics, as well as, if you know, you can break those down into user flows, or user stories, excuse me. Then next we have wireframing. There's actually 3 stages of wireframing, and if I refer back to the slide that had the loose process, usually low fidelity wireframing you want to do before a project gets started, but maybe your project has a lot of back-end integration, so you could easily do this in an initial sprint. But you really shouldn't get into the page layouts of your application until you have some at least low fidelity wireframes completed. And this basically is like the initial step of UI. So it's basically mapping out in a visual sense and kind of prioritizing functionalities for each page. And this gives you like kind of sense. You can go through the sitemap and basically wireframe out each page, and so you get a sense of maybe we don't need a navigation. Maybe we can easily just, there's like one primary objective, and we can just button to button to button to page to page. And so this is like a second level of iteration on top of your user flows. So you get a little, maybe this doesn't quite work. Maybe this should be more prominent functionality-wise than something else. Next step, you have medium fidelity wireframing. And so this is one more step down the line that you're iterating on your ideas. You had some rough idea of what you want it to look like in your low fidelity. Medium fidelity is done typically in grayscale, and the reason for that is because we all tend to get lost with color. We like color and we get attracted to it, so things lose priority when we put colors on things. So this is to help rein in the focus on where things are placed and their priority within the application. So you can easily do this you can make a series of JPEGs and do a PDF, or if you're familiar with InVision, that kind of takes that to the next level where you can throw it up on InVision and actually pseudo-click areas as if they were actual buttons to get you to that, so you feel more of what the flow is going to be like if it were an actual application. And lastly, you have high fidelity wireframes, and this is more the full-on polished design of an application, how it will ultimately look like within after you've developed it. And so this is where we can see like color relations and making sure we're hitting like branding and typography and all those elements that make your brand yours. And we like to limit this to only 2 to 3, or depending on the size of your application, maybe like core areas of functionality that are going to require a little more finessing. We only like to do high fidelity wireframes on a limited number of things because this can be very time consuming. To make, if you have 40 screens, to do this for every single screen is a lot of time. And honestly, you can take a look at the screen on the right and see, okay, well, I can see the H1 is going to be this font and this large. Headers for this section is going to look like this, and you can see actually this size and this size are actually the same size. It's just with background, it's a little different. So you can already start to lay out what the theming and styling required for an application is from literally one screen. And if, as you go through the process and you get to a piece of functionality that you didn't wireframe out, you can easily go back and rework it if it's not looking the way you want it to within the modeler. And the other reason why we limit it to the number of screens is we want to keep that speed going. The thing that Mendix offers is ability to develop so quickly, UX shouldn't be holding that back. So we've done a lot of the pre-planning of the application. We are starting to build the application and create pages and layouts. This theme creation and styling is done, I would say you do this part of the UX process the most. So this is really the implementation of taking all that hard work that we put into creating user flows and really refining what the application's doing, and then implementing it and making sure that the content that's going to be pulled in looks good and works well. So this is done, the theme is created when we did the high fidelity wireframes, and the styling for an application is both the CSS framework that we have and using CSS, but you can't just use CSS. You have to also work in the Mendix page layouts and use CSS classes to call the CSS framework. So you have to be working in tandem. So if you're doing the development or someone on your team is doing development on the front end side of things, you have to be both in the CSS as well as within the page layouts themselves. So as we go through the sprints of our agile process, we want to make sure that design is being kept abreast of every step of the way. So if midway through the project someone says, hey, we actually need this functionality or something else, or something changed, or this is not working the way we want it to, we need to change how it works, design needs to be kept in line with everyone else. So we have to make sure that design and user experience is always being upheld throughout the process of creating the application. And so there's a design Q&A that's held in conjunction with every sprint review. And then you can also do some making sure your CSS code is clean and easy to use. You can also, during the design Q&A, check for consistency among maybe icons or page layouts being used, components used, just so that if there's a couple people, different people developing, and they're touching the page layouts, making sure everyone's on the same track. And this is also where you would create new user stories for the next sprint in relation to UX and UI. So the last step along our journey is usability testing. And usability testing should be done, you can do it as frequently as you like, between, you can do it internally between sprints, but we really recommend also doing it between app releases, because usability is a way to check to see if the designs and user flows that we've mapped out truly work for our users. So we would get people who are actually going to use the application. So in the case of a lot of Mendix applications, we're in a unique situation in that instead of having to go a random selection of people, a lot of times it's going to be your employees that are actually using these tools. So you can just have them try the application, and it's important. I've heard some stories where people will actually show their prospective users how to use the tool and then be like, okay, go ahead, and then gather that, oh, this should be this and this should be that. You don't want to do that. You want to make it as if someone has never seen this before and give them a task. So I need you to purchase this item, and then record what they're doing, so then you can see how long it takes them to get from the first step to the second step and find these different items, and actually ask them to maybe talk to what they're doing as they do it, so you get a sense for their thought process. So this is really useful. So from that, all that data can be collected, and then you can turn that information into new user stories and figure out new ways to better serve who these applications are actually for people. So that is usability UX in a nutshell, and what the different lingos are and terminology that goes with it, as well as a broad overview of a step-to-step process of UX and Mendix.
Great. Thanks, Russell. That was great. Really helpful presentation. As I mentioned, we left some time for Q&A, so go ahead and just type in any questions that you have. I wanted to point out this note we have here on this final slide, especially for our friends who are joining today from the Netherlands. Our Rotterdam office is working with a partner online department on a meetup event on this topic of UX, and that's going to be held on March 23rd. So we'll leave this slide up if you want the URL, or you can find more information on our developer site, which is developer.mendix.com. And Russell and I have invited our colleague Adam Fothergill to join us for this Q&A portion of the webinar. Adam, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Adam's a consultant on our professional services team, so we know he'll be helpful in fielding some of your questions here. So let's go ahead and get started. Russell, I'll hand it back to you. You can go through these questions.
All right, so I have a question here that says, how do I integrate UX in a project that is already in development or about to be released? So I would suggest using usability testing to achieve that. So that way you can see how people actually respond to the application. And because we may have hunches as to why something is not working well, but if we can actually show it to the people that are actually going to be using the application, we should do that. And then from there, we can gather what's not working well and go back to creating user flows to target that functionality that we want to rework, and then take that and do another sprint or two to work that into your project as it stands. See a question, will we be making the slides available? Yes, the slides will be available after the webinar. There will also be a PDF that touches on more of the things I spoke about that may not be on the slides themselves. So I see one about, in Mendix, do you still do paper prototyping? If yes, can you give an example of how to use it to be effective? So, for example, the user flows that I spoke on are something where I find it to be really effective if you just whiteboard that. You actually, for the user flows, you actually probably want to do that in collaboration with the product owner as well, someone from the business side as well as someone from the development side. So you should have all areas of expertise all together so that the business goals can be reached and met and feel like they've been satisfied, as well as development and what they need. And then as the UX expert, you can bring to the table what the user needs. And so I would recommend actually doing that on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper, kind of mapping out what you how you think step by step is. And that's really a first iteration of prototyping, because you're figuring out functionality and seeing how it would work. And then even lo-fi wireframes, you can do it by hand. I find that's a lot quicker and effective than trying to go into Photoshop or something and doing that. That takes a lot more time than just doing it by paper by paper. So. Okay, so there's a question, does Mendix have support for SAS or other CSS scripting tools? Actually, the UX, there's a framework we use, a UI framework, which you can find under, if you look up ux.mendix.com, we have a framework already in place that is based on Bootstrap as a baseline, but then have blown out all of our various widgets and all their styling hooks and all that stuff is all compiled through. It's on SAS, and so you can actually, if you go there, you can play with the different themes we already have. We also have a tool where you can select, the primary color, maybe the header color, the nav color, and all these things, and switch around these colors, and it will automatically create a theme for you. So, but you don't have to stop there. You can easily download that or download one of the themes and open it up and add your own partials and do whatever you need to do that you want to integrate with SAS. So someone else mentioned Giphy icons. I'm not familiar with Giphy icons, but as you know, I'm sure you've probably run into, we use glyphicons as our icons, but you can use any kind of icon font pretty easily through SAS. So you basically need to have, if you are familiar with like Font Awesome icons, they have a whole CSS. You can kind of use that as the baseline template, and so glyphicon. Yeah, so if you wanted to use the pro version of glyphicons, you'd have to get the font file. You have to get the CSS file that makes the declaration of each class name, and then call it through as a class through the modeler. So Adam is here to help me out with some technical questions. There's a question here.
So we have one question on adding JavaScript. So you can use, there's a handful of files, webinars that we've published before on creating your own custom widgets, and those are all written in JavaScript. So if you want to add any kind of JavaScript files there, you can reference those webinars. Those are up on the developer site as well.
Cool, thanks, Adam. As far as there's a question about, is there documentation online about Mendix SAS framework based on Bootstrap? And you can find that at ux.mendix.com, and that has everything you'll need to know about all that stuff. Okay, we got a question here about, can I just style my application inline within the modeler? Why should I use a theme and classes? It's a very good question. So inline, for those of you who aren't super savvy on CSS, is basically it will add the class or the styling directly on the HTML tag. And it seems like when you first start an application, that's super easy. I just throw it in there. But what if you have a header that you want to look a certain way, but that header is in 30 different places? Do you really want to put that in 30 different places? With the class, you can just take those styles, put it in the class, and put the class on there. And then if later on, hey, your boss says, no, that's too bold, we need to make it green. All you have to do is go into your CSS and change that color of that header to green, and it happens all throughout. And that's really the power of CSS. CSS stands for cascading style sheets, and that's exactly what it would do. It cascades throughout all the different places that's implemented. So there's a question here about, do you think Mendix as a framework impacts how you do user testing? E.g., the framework has already undergone testing, so you don't have to test as much as if it were something built from the ground up. I would disagree with that just because you may have elements. The UI framework kind of has each element designed by itself. If you have 3 different widgets together, you got to make sure that their relationship makes sense, where they're placed, and all that sort of thing. So you still have to do usability testing in regards to that.
Yeah, and I would add on to that. There are definitely things that the platform takes care of for you, but when you're switching versions, or if you've changed any kind of piece of microflow or logic, even outside of the usability, you always want to go back and double check that, because if you've upgraded a widget to a different version, it may not be compatible with something else that you've got going on. So it definitely lightens the technical testing that you need to do, but from a user acceptance kind of workflow testing, I definitely advise doing complete testing there.
So I think we're going to wrap up here, and I'm going to pass it back over to Melissa.
Great. Russell, thank you for an awesome presentation today, and Adam, thanks for joining us for the Q&A portion. As I mentioned, this has been recorded, so we'll send you a link to the recording, and we're also going to send you a link to the PDF that Russell mentioned, which has some more detail. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and have a great weekend.